Good afternoon. Today I want to talk to you about the very interesting topic of crafting unique species for your tabletop role-playing game worlds that you build and brainstorm. And even if you use existing worlds, you may need a new opponent, a new foe, someone out of left field or someone challenging that you want to put in front of the players, a first contact situation. And of course, first contact situations are the bread and butter of the science fiction genre. And while the Starfinder RPG, a game that I'm covering on my channel leading up to its release, bends more towards science fantasy, I think applying a lot of the ideas and the rubrics from science fiction can be very useful for the brainstorming process and the world building process. I've got a very unique take on the Ysoki, the rat folk-like race that is a cornerstone of what Starfinder has identified itself as. And I want to share that with you. But first I want to talk through a rubric of how to create interesting species and give you an overview of some of the classic techniques that science fiction authors have used since the genre really took off in the 1950s. So without further ado, let's blast off. I am the Complex Games Apologist. So for today's disclaimer moment, I want to go ahead and follow up on a little bit of my saltiness from my first video about the Starfinder races. I've sort of changed my tune. I've put myself to task. One of the hang-ups that I had was that we didn't really have enough art, and we definitely didn't have the racial traits as they would be in the book, so that we could start doing world building of our own. But I've decided to sort of leap ahead of that and see if I can't get started on my own. And for the second part of our disclaimer, I want to briefly say that I'm something of a skeptic of a lot of the talk that goes on right now about RPGs vis-a-vis racism. I hope to have a video posted on this topic later on this week, outlining my stance. But for now, I would direct you to my video about egalitarianism of women and LGBT characters vis-a-vis medieval realistic settings, and how I think that a moderate path is the one that I would advocate. The reason that I want to underscore my position and my skepticism is because I feel that a lot of the talk around this topic conflates racism with speciesism. Why do I think that this is troubling? Well, because sometimes the differences are irreconcilable. In the most iconic work of the fantasy genre, J.R.R. Tolkien has the elves created by Eru Ilúvatar. They long for the trees of the west. They dwell in the beauty of Middle-earth. And yet men are given the gift of death. Meanwhile, Morgoth, in his perversion, debauches the elves to become what will be the orcs, through whatever strange and awful artifice. And what about the love children of the goddess of the earth, that she kept secret from Ilúvatar? These would become the dwarves. These are some pretty fundamental differences in how these races arise, what they long for, and who they are. In the science fiction realm, the differences can be that much more irreconcilable. Aliens can be really sinister. They can want to eat your soul out for the fun of it. After all, take a look at this video from Mars Attacks.
Why be enemies? Because we're different? Think of the things that we could do. Think how strong we would be. Earth and Mars together. We can have it all, or we can smash it all. Why can't we all just get along?
So, you see what I'm saying? Sometimes the differences are irreconcilable. And at the same time, I think that those differences between us and these really alien others underscore how much alike we as humans are. And I reject racism here on this planet as well. But I do think that it may have a place in the worlds and the stories that we tell in gaming. And I think that it can be a really challenging prospect for someone who is an egalitarian to roleplay a bigot, to figure out why it is that someone thinks things like that. So meanwhile, the linchpin of this video takes its inspiration from a sort of social science that attempts to identify why we see things differently, why we got to where we are now. To put it briefly, there's this huge totality of preferences and prejudices informed by who we are, where we come from, how we got here, and how we see the world. It's called social constructionism in some theories of social science.
Social constructionism is a theory that knowledge and many aspects of the world around us are not real in and of themselves. They only exist because we give them reality through social agreement. Things like nations, books, even money don't exist in the absence of human society. Nations are groups of people who happen to share a language or history. Books are paper with scribbles. And money is just pieces of paper and metal that have no value other than what we have assigned them. The concept of the self can be considered a social construct too. Our identity is created by interactions with other people and our reactions to the expectations of society. There are two threads of social constructionism, the weak and the strong. Weak social constructionism proposes that social constructs are dependent on brute facts, which are the most basic and fundamental and don't rely on any other facts. Brute facts are...
Now, I am no great authority on social constructionism, but I wanted to point out that this theory exists and that it is applied as a method of analysis, because when you're creating the histories, the worldviews, the reasons that species have come to be, you're also, in the view of this theory, explaining why they see the world as it is, what constitutes reality and facts to them. Their subjective point of view might inform everything about what's true to them. Now, that's not necessarily how I view philosophy in my personal life, but I think it's an effective world-building tool to think about how minds will see things differently. Before we move on, I think that we've got to operationalize what a starfaring species is. They have tool use. They're probably a planet-wide civilization because it takes that much cooperation just to get up into space. And cooperation and survival, how did they form a civilization? Why haven't they killed each other off, or why aren't they chasing each other around and killing each other rather than building rocket ships? And then finally, what is their reason to be out here in outer space en masse? Why have they chosen a starfaring path? Why are they interested in space rather than staying at home? Now, the answer can of course be that your character is exceptional, and the answer to any of those questions that I just posed before could be that there was an intervention in this race's past. And of course, because this is Starfinder, the answers could be we don't remember because of the gap. But I think that presents an opportunity for many of these answers to be discovered in play, for them to be sought out, as so many species are looking for answers to who they are, and they know that they may be buried in the bones of their ancestors. I think that it's inevitable that the first place that we're going to begin to identify what makes one species different from another is with their visual and their physical differences. What makes a cow different from an owl? What makes an owl different from another kind of bird? I think that even among the sort of folks who don't subscribe to the theory of evolution, they do grant that these differences are due to a suitedness to the role of these organisms, that they just do what they do best, well, because of the way that they are. But to go deeper into answering this question, using the techniques that I'm going to use, one does need to cede to the basic postulate of the theory of evolution, that features that affect survival are selected for. And when it comes to crafting intelligent species that will become science fiction adventurers, we have to grant that intelligence is a feature, language is a feature, tool use is a feature, and the hands or the tentacles that allow tool use is going to be a feature. And becoming a planet-wide civilization that's able to take to the stars and has reasons to get out there, that's also a feature. And answering these questions can be really empowering. And of course, intervention by a deity or by an advanced species, like these guys might think, is also a feature in its own way. And I think it'll probably show up in my games, in spite of it probably not being the baseline condition for most species. So I'm really excited to talk to you about my version of the Ysoki, and how they became a spacefaring civilization and a tool-using species. So in just a moment, I'm going to introduce you to my version of the Ysoki, that I think are a really exciting take on how a rat-like species could become a starfaring civilization. But I want to point out that that list of intelligence, tool use, and language, and civilization, the order that those things come in does not have to be regular. They don't have to follow the same path that we did. There are species of birds that are really good at dropping clams onto rocks, but to say that they're intelligent, well, that's another matter entirely. And at the same time, some folks will note that dolphins and marine mammals like orcas are incredibly clever and might even reach the human level of intellect. And yet tool use is out of the question because they have to be so water dynamic. And without tool use, it's very difficult to end up building a rocket ship. And for that matter, if you live underwater, metallurgy is going to be an issue. But the exciting thing is that doesn't take species like this out of the picture. It instead prompts us with a very interesting question of how did these aquatic species take to land and start finding metals? How did they build furnaces? What drove them to do so? What sort of environmental pressures, or perhaps just really deeply achieved curiosity from millennia of contemplation in the seas drove them to do this? And how would that color their behavior? And what would that mean to their stat line and who they were at the tabletop? Well, that's for you to do when you're world building.